Texas, another Iraq War veteran.
The chance to be Pacifica's executive director and produce shows like Informed Dissent came my way by accident. Years before, I had met an activist librarian on a plane by striking up a conversation about Z, a left-wing magazine she was reading. I was editing Toward Freedom, another small but respected publication that covered international affairs. The librarian and I hit it off, and she provided a stream of news, ideas, and leads for articles over the next decade. She was also a loyal yet disgruntled listener to a Pacifica radio station. So, when the top job became available, she let me know. Dan Coughlin, the previous ED, had resigned months earlier after 3 years on the job. Growing up in England, he had covered crime for Interpress Service in New York before moving over to Pacifica in 1996 by way of Democracy Now!, an election series that became a network hit and made Amy Goodwin a household name in progressive circles. After producing Democracy Now! For 2 years, he took over Pacifica Network News, just in time to become embroiled in a fight for the organization's future. Even before Pacifica evolved into a national network with 5 owned stations and dozens of affiliates, there were internal struggles, but until the 90s, each station totally controlled its own programming, and that kept most of the fighting local. Then rumors began to circulate that central management and the national board wanted to seize control of content to increase listenership and shift the funding model from reliance on listener donations toward foundations and other sources. By 1999, when the board amended the bylaws to make itself self-appointing, ostensibly to comply with federal requirements, Pacifica's community-based culture was actively resisting what was often called an attempt to hijack or mainstream the organization. For Coughlin, the question became, should PNN, a daily newscast aired on more than 60 Pacifica affiliate stations, cover the deepening crisis? Earlier that year, after KPFA station manager Nicole Sawaya and popular correspondent Larry Bensky were abruptly fired, staff began to defy a long-standing policy of not airing internal grievances. Going on the air, some charged that Pacifica was a top-heavy bureaucracy, hungry for mainstream legitimacy, preoccupied with ratings, unaccountable to the community. There was even evidence that the board might consider selling stations, a fear that often spreads during times of stress. Listeners could read about major developments, like arrests at KPFA, a staff lockout, street protests, in the Los Angeles Times, in the Washington Post, and other corporate outlets. But Pacifica's news operations were under orders, keep the struggle off the air. For a while, Coughlin went along, but in late October, however, when 16 affiliate stations declared a day without Pacifica and boycotted its programs, he decided to break the silence and add a report on the protest and what was called, in a way, an understatement, a labor management dispute. Here's what it said in part. This summer, more than 100 persons were arrested and thousands took to the streets at the oldest listener-sponsored station in the country to protest Pacifica staffing decisions. The 16 Pacifica stations from 11 states called for the network to adopt new open, accountable governance and to continue to support community-based journalism, which they said made Pacifica great. The report lasted only 37 seconds, and yet, when Coughlin returned to work after a long weekend, a terse email from Executive Director Lynn Chadwick was waiting. "You're no longer the news director," she told him. Later that day, he was reassigned to a murky task force on programming and governance. He stayed on staff for another year, but his removal confirmed the suspicions of others that censorship had replaced free speech and editorial independence at Pacifica. 2 years later, In 2002, after a titanic struggle and multiple lawsuits, produced a new board and a decidedly more democratic and decentralized structure, Dan Coughlin returned, this time as Pacifica's first post-revolution chief executive. Unfortunately, he inherited a mess, millions in debt, missing records, an aging audience, and a legacy of distrust. Yet somehow he managed, with the help of loyal listeners and a strong team, to bring the organization back to stability. What remained unclear was why and how, despite such a major accomplishment, he nevertheless went from golden boy in 2002 to object of scorn just 3 years later. There were accusations of shady payouts and lax oversight and contempt for the new bylaws and the democratic structure. In fact, a protest was staged outside the main office in Berkeley during his last day on the job. Just how did all that happen? This was the job that I was about to start. The deeper I looked, the more convoluted and intractable the problems appeared. Changes and charges and countercharges of secrecy and waste and racism, sexism, harassment and violence, turf battles over local fiefdoms, manipulation and alleged fraud. It seemed like a fratricidal war with no end in sight. A friend who worked for community radio stations, hearing that I was up for the job, mildly defined the main issue as an actual and perceived lack of transparency. He also mentioned poor fundraising and development, ineffective mediation of personnel problems, and legendary racial battles over the control and color of programming. And it reminded me of just how easily reality can become blurred by misinformation. That summer, Jeff Ruck, the director of the Public Employees Environmental Responsibility Group, had issued a relevant assessment of a much larger and even more dysfunctional bureaucracy, the federal government. He concluded that it was suffering from a severe disinformation syndrome. Could this be what was afflicting Pacifica? Theories presented as facts, information massaged to promote specific spin, cherry-picked evidence. Whether intentional or not, Pacifica's convoluted politics and history seemed to have created, as Bob Woodward put it in his book that summer about the Watergate secret source and deep throat, an entire world of doubt. Yes, years before the rise of Donald Trump, millions of people were already living in fantasy worlds. According to a 2009 NBC Wall Street Journal poll, 45% of Americans believed that health care reform would create death panels. Remember that withheld medical care for the elderly. Fantasy. 55% thought that this medical care system would create health insurance for illegal immigrants, and half said it would pay for women to have abortions, and neither of those things true. Some already thought that climate change was a hoax, that Obama was a Muslim, and that the government should have literacy tests for voting. Still others, however, saw that ecological and economic catastrophe was looming the day after tomorrow. And others thought that martial law was imminent, or wanted states to seize public resources as trustees of the commons. As sociology professor Peter Phillips explained, too many people, especially consumers of TV news, were embedded in a state of excited delirium, of knowinglessness, not to mention alienation, misinformation, and confusion. And Pacifica was certainly not immune. That's all for now. Next time, Pacifica's early days and the growth of a progressive radio network from New York and D.C. to Houston, L.A., and Berkeley. This is Greg Guma with the People's Republic podcast. This week, sound was from the 1970 War and Peace Voices from WBAI and the 2006 series Informed Dissent.